You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning in to the Teachthought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Teachthought Professional Development. And if you've happened to find us through iTunes or some other listening portal, I invite you to check out our two websites, which are teachthought.com, which is our main website, which has all of our blogging content, as well as Teachthought Professional Development's website, which is wegrowteachers.com, which has some of that content, but also much more information about the workshops and services that we help schools with worldwide. Also of note is a reminder that registration for our third annual summer learning event, Teachthought Grow 19, is ongoing. The dates are July 16th through 19th. We'll be back at the really great Fraser History Museum Loft in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. We're happy to be partnering with the National School Reform faculty for the pre-conference day, which is July 16th. And that is called Addressing Elephants, where we will use the learning of protocols, which is one of the specialties or the specialty of the National School Reform faculty, in ways that we can help our students learn how to have difficult conversations about difficult topics. So I'm really looking forward to co-facilitating that with the director of the NSRF, Michelle Mattoon. And then we'll go on to July 17th, 18th, and 19th, which is the main part of Grow 19 and centered around our popular Foundations of Project-Based Learning workshops. From those 3 days, you'll walk away with a better understanding of project-based learning, as well as a project for implementation in your classroom or in your school if you're a school leader. Just a side note, you can register for all 4 days of Grow 19, or you can register for the pre-conference day or the main 3 days separately as well. And again, details can be found at wegrowteachers.com/Grow19. Also, please remember that it's really helpful for us to spread the word if you share the podcasts and review them wherever you listen. It helps us to get more listeners, which helps us to get better guests and more guests, and hopefully you find it helpful in thinking more deeply about education and your teaching craft. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Jennifer Chang Wathall, who connected with me from Hong Kong. She's an independent educational consultant, and her area of expertise is concept-based curriculum instruction, especially concept-based mathematics. So we started off by defining that and kind of taking a dive into really what does that mean, which leans heavily on social constructivism, which is clearly something that we have in common. So we talked about some of the challenges and aspects of teaching in that way, things like the time and the depth and transfer and understanding and knowledge versus understanding and the ability to learn skills and be able to do something with them. We touched as well on the fear and intimidation that many people have with math and how we might overcome that, as well as some differentiation topics of supporting different levels of teachers, and sort of ended by talking about grouping of students in a way that is meaningful and not labeling students, and how that might play out in classrooms. So always interesting and fun to talk with somebody who is pretty like-minded. And certainly math and teaching of math is a worthwhile subject to be diving into. So I enjoyed the conversation and I hope you find it useful. Jennifer, welcome to the podcast. Let me give you the opportunity, as I like to do, for you to introduce yourself. You're connecting with me from Hong Kong, and you're, 12 hours, I think, ahead, right? Of
Yep.
us here in the Eastern Standard Time Zone. So tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi, Drew. First of all, I want to say hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm a big fan. I think I was just telling you earlier. I actually listened to your podcast on my way up to the peak in Hong Kong, so I'm 12 hours ahead. I'm an independent educational consultant. I'm also a part-time instructor for the University of Hong Kong, and I was a teacher for 27 years. So I enjoyed a wonderful 27 years in the classroom, and I decided a couple of years ago to pursue full-time consulting so that I could perhaps maybe have a bigger impact on student learning and concept-based mathematics in particular. So my area of specialty is really concept-based curriculum and instruction for all discipline areas, pre-K to 12, but my the subject that I absolutely love is mathematics, and that's what I help schools with in terms of the development of mathematics curriculum, unit planning, and looking at what learning looks like for their students.
So you taught for 27 years, and listeners won't know this, but we connected and were looking at each other on camera, and so I'm guessing you started teaching when you were, what, 3 years old? Because you
Oh, thank you. And I didn't even pay you to say that. Yeah, I like to say I started at 12. No, I didn't. I think it's probably the good lighting in my office that you're seeing.
and so where was that? Was that teaching experience in Hong Kong, or what? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it was mainly in Hong Kong. So I taught 10-year-olds to 18-year-olds at secondary school, all sorts of different programs. Some programs were British-based, some were the International Baccalaureate. But I did actually have the privilege of working at the United Nations School in New York as well. And they're one of the original IB schools. So I was on secondment to New York for a period of time during my 27-year career, and loved every minute in the classroom. I must say it was a very difficult decision for me to leave the classroom because I think I was born to be a teacher. You know how sometimes some educators that you meet, they either fall into it and fall in love with teaching. Others are really just born to absolutely love teaching. When I was 12 years old, my mother actually took me to a fortune teller in the mountains of Taiwan. So she is from Taiwan. And this fortune teller looked into my face and she said, "You're going to be a math educator for the rest of your life." And so who knew that she was actually going to be correct in her predictions? But she also looked into my brother's face and she said to my brother, "You're going to be a doctor, for the rest of your life." And my brother is a surgeon in Australia with his own practice. So, who knew that she was actually going to be quite accurate in her predictions? And I've just loved, I think, that light bulb moment that you see, when your students just get something or get that kind of idea, that deep understanding that you're trying to help them to reach.
Yeah, it's a little spooky and interesting. I don't know if you know my background, but I've kind of felt the other way. I didn't have any soothsayer tell me I was going to be a teacher, but my mother was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, so it was almost like the tractor beam was pulling me in, and for years I was pretty sure that I was not going to be a teacher and didn't want to be a teacher, watching my mother and thinking, well, that doesn't seem like much fun. And my mother was my teacher for a short time. She taught my brother for a little bit longer, but when she was my teacher, about 6 weeks in, she quit and took a different job. So I don't know if that was because of me or because of a better opportunity, but I'm going to assume it was a better opportunity. But yeah, when I entered a classroom as a substitute teacher, because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life after getting a political science degree and figuring out that there was no real dire need for political scientists, then
Yes.
I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and I substitute taught. And I remember going into a first grade classroom and being just absolutely terrified. But the rewards or I just really enjoyed it. And I thought, wow, this is really pretty amazing. And went back and got my teaching certificate. So it is a calling.
That's a nice journey, and it seems like you were destined in terms of your genetics. I mean, I think that relationship that you build with your students is, it can't be replaced by a textbook or a video. We bring these human skills and these connections and this relationship that we build, I think, is just so special. And I think that's what kept me going for so many years. I actually juggled 2 careers for the last 15. So I ran a lot of IB workshops during my weekends while I was at school. But I really, did not want to leave the classroom until really I felt that perhaps I could have a bigger impact on more students worldwide.
Yeah, the relationships piece is really a big piece. People say, do you miss being in the classroom? And I do, mostly for that exact thing. I mean, I enjoy the process of teaching, but I still get to do that when I work with teachers, because there is still that transaction of teaching in our workshops. But the relationships is what we don't get as much as we used to. I mean, we still get it somewhat as we work with schools in repeated ways, and hopefully more so than less. But the day-to-day relationships, and I coach my daughter in soccer, and I really enjoy those relationships, and that's such an important piece for sure. So
completely, one of the most important pieces, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to get sidetracked with that conversation, but let's talk about this concept-based mathematics and approach, because I'm not very familiar with that term as being, I guess, I don't know if it's fair to say it's a pedagogy, but an approach of concept-based curriculum instruction, especially with mathematics. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, it does involve pedagogy, and it does involve also the curriculum development. So there's 2 parts to it. And concept-based mathematics really is about teaching students the conceptual understanding, moving away from rote memorization and only procedural aspect of mathematics, but really trying to focus on the beauty and the creativity, I think, of mathematics through the conceptual language that it offers. It's a 3-dimensional curriculum and instruction model. And so what do I mean by that? Well, the facts and skills are the 2-dimensional parts that are part of mathematics learning. So I'm an advocate of someone who says that we don't need to sacrifice content to really appreciate and bring joy into maths learning. However, I think often the conceptual understandings are neglected or ignored. So we actually create a synergy between the facts and skills with conceptual understandings. So in other words, the facts and skills represent low levels of thinking. Conceptual understandings represent the high levels of thinking, and we want to create a synergy between those low levels and high levels. And that's what creates that 3-dimensional model for curriculum and instruction. The facts and skills providing that foundation for those deeper conceptual understandings in mathematics. And I think, if I could just put it more simply, that the concept-based mathematics model really helps students to understand the purpose of why they are learning something. I like to think that the content is necessary, and it's really a vehicle to help us to be able to foster conceptual understanding and to be able to develop critical thinking with our students. So in a nutshell, that's concept-based curriculum and instruction for mathematics. There are obviously various pieces to the jigsaw that make up an entire curriculum and support in terms of instruction and pedagogy. So I'll mention one of them. One of the tenets that we really try to encourage in a concept-based model is the inductive teaching approach. Drew, have you heard of the inductive teaching approach? Because it seems to have taken off on the Twitter sphere. I saw that Jennifer Gonzalez from Cult of Pedagogy has made various videos and things about it. Are you familiar?
Yeah, we've talked about that, and there's some relation to that and differentiated instruction, right?
Yeah, precisely. So the inductive teaching approach is really trying to help students to question, to conjecture, from specific examples, and then to generalize. So you're really encouraging students to generalize for themselves once you give them prompts and scaffolding. And this is all through the inquiry-based learning process. And this is as opposed to the deductive teaching approach, where you give students the generalizations and then, they go and work on specific examples. So that's the reverse of the inductive approach. And as much as possible, we really try to encourage that inductive teaching approach so that students are used to generalizing once they go through a very carefully planned, intentionally planned learning engagement through an inquiry process.
So give us an example of what that looks like, if you can.
I'm so glad you asked that. I was just about to, because I was thinking, I'm talking very generally, and I think it's important that we have some concrete examples. So a deductive approach, let's say if we're looking at the area of a circle, the deductive approach would be, well, here's the formula to find the area of a circle. Here are 3 examples of, different values that we're given, and we can substitute into this formula. Now go and practice 10 questions from your textbook on how to use this formula. So that would be the deductive approach. Now, if we were to help students generalize and we wanted to adopt an inductive teaching approach, we may give students 4 circles. They're split into a different number of sectors. So maybe the first circle, all these circles are the same size. Maybe the first circle is split into 4 sectors. The second is 8. The third circle is 16. And the last circle is 32. Now, with the circle with 4 sectors, you'll ask students to cut the sectors out and to pace the sectors 1 up, 1 down. And then you'd ask them to cut the circle with 8 sectors, 16, 32. And what happens is they look at the 32 sectored circle, and they can see that it starts approaching a rectangle. And they can start deriving the formula, because we know that the limiting sum of these sectors actually approach a rectangle, and they can then come up with a generalization and a justification of why the area of a circle is pi r squared. So that would be an example from about grade 7 or grade 8 level.
So you're trying to get them to, I guess, ask questions and
yes.
and really make meaning of it themselves, as opposed to
yes.
giving them the sort of answer, I guess, or the formula.
Precisely.
And working from that perspective.
Precisely, and all through a social constructivist approach. So to put another jigsaw piece in, so we have inquiry that's involved in the inductive teaching approach, and we also want to promote social constructivism, where students are making meaning and understanding through that learning engagement, but by collaborating or discussing or interacting, with peers. I always say that, in the classroom, I am not the answer machine. That is not my role in the classroom. And I'm not even the sage on the stage or even guide on the side. I consider myself the meddler in the middle. So I kind of float around and, I kind of meddle with students' minds, but provoke thought and curiosity and, help and guide them if they need more scaffolding or prompts. Help and guide them to their own generalizations, to them actually communicating their understanding through a generalization.
So what do you say to people who might push back on that and say, one of two criticisms that I hear pretty regularly about this kind of approach to teaching, this social constructivism, that one, it takes way too much time, and two, it's really hard to do, and so you have teachers who struggle at doing it, and the learning and trajectory of students is going to suffer because of that.
I'm so glad you asked this question because I have the privilege of working with a lot of different international schools around the world, educators from pre-K to 12. And they're probably the two biggest challenges that we face, when we work together. My role is always as a coach and a facilitator and to really support curriculum development and pedagogical strategies in the classroom. But those two issues of time and how challenging and difficult this is, you're right. This will take time initially to plan. It encourages a collaborative professionalism as well, something I think that Andy Hargraves talks about, but really, promoting colleagues to be able to talk and discuss and plan lessons together takes time. And even in the lesson, as you're going through the lesson, for example, such as a circle geometry on the area of a circle, I can tell my students the formula in 10 seconds. However, that learning engagement that I have designed may take 30 minutes, may take 40 minutes. So where is all this time going to come from? Well, I think it's a matter, so to address the issue of time, it's a matter of really rethinking what is time. The time that you invest in inquiry-based learning through an inductive teaching approach is really, I think, saved by the deep understanding that students have, and that in the long run, you do not have to keep going back and reteaching things. So if I actually introduce the formula for the area of a circle in 10 seconds, maybe I'm going to have to reteach that, next month or in 6 months, and because the students have not remembered it. When we go through this inductive inquiry learning approach, what students experience is deeply embedded into their memories, and so they actually have a better understanding to be able to apply and transfer. Now, the second challenge, Drew, that you talked about was this is hard, and how do we do this? And it is. I think traditional mathematics is quite linear in that, first of all, you teach mathematics topics in isolation. So, you teach geometry for a year, you might teach algebra for a year. In this kind of model, we really want students to understand the connections between different mathematical topics because we're an interconnected conceptual language. And so we may be designing also different units that combine algebra and geometry, for example, and that requires time, and it is challenging. It's not easy, and it is difficult. But I think we have to think about what do we think is best in terms of student learning? What can we do to plan experiences and to plan units so that we're not focusing on rote memorization, we're not creating this anxiety and fear of mathematics, which is, I unfortunately see that a lot. I was talking to a head of school a couple of months ago. He's in charge of a pre-K to 12 through school. And he confessed to me that he was absolutely terrified of mathematics. And he, broke out into cold sweats anytime anyone asked him anything about mathematics. And that's so sad because I think so many people around the world feel like that about mathematics. So I think we need to do something to help students see the beauty, the creativity of mathematics through an inquiry approach, to be able to critically think and apply and transfer and basically bring back joy to the classroom so that they can appreciate what mathematics really is about, because it's not about rote procedures and memorization. And unfortunately, that's been the approach. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that when you're talking about it being in sort of a linear fashion, I feel that history has been taught for years that way as well. I was a history teacher,
yes,
among other things, and I find that to be just a very odd way to teach things. I mean, I guess it makes sense because things happen in a lot, in a timeline, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to teach them that way. But I'm wondering,
exactly,
the question that came to my head as you were talking is how, because that fear and intimidation of math and thinking like a mathematician, I think is a very real piece of this puzzle. But in what ways do you think math thinking is different than other sort of disciplines of thinking, if you do, and how is it similar?
I think that mathematics has been approached completely differently, but that's what's created this anxiety. And I don't think I think mathematics is similar to history. And I love how you've drawn analogies between the two disciplines, because, history should not be taught about, 1911 or 1914. It should really be taught in terms of the concepts of conflict or war or power or leadership. And then looking at lots of examples in history that fall under that very important conceptual idea. Mathematics is the same. So I think perhaps, what has gone wrong, perhaps in terms of traditional history teaching, is exactly the same as traditional mathematics teaching. We should be really teaching mathematics through conceptual ideas, and really trying to focus and understand what mathematics is about through lots of different examples, rather than specific algorithms or specific facts that are locked in a particular time, place, or situation.
Well, it's interesting in a way that the pieces of history are, and I believe should be, really connected to sort of humanistic and humanism. Those are those things you mentioned, like power. But
yes,
when we look at the circumference of a circle, that's not particularly emotionally engaging, right? So those concepts, how do we make those concepts, I guess, in a way? And maybe we don't need to make them. Maybe I'm coming at this from the wrong perspective. Make them more, quote unquote, sort of sexy.
Well, I think it's about context. Yes, there are real life applications in history. So maybe that's something that is more humanistic that people can identify with. But mathematics, within a context, and it could be real life. It doesn't have to be real life. Within a context, can really cultivate critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, these very important 21st century skills that, have emerged as more important than content necessarily. So I think, we use the vehicle. I think I mentioned earlier, mathematics in terms of its content is really a vehicle to develop these very important skills. But the language itself is beautiful. So while Drew, you can't agree with me that the area of a circle is absolutely beautiful and creative, I'm going to try and change your mind. Isn't it fascinating that all circles, if you look at the circumference and you look at the diameter, it doesn't matter what size the circle is, that it's always this wonderful fixed constant. So any circle, if you find the circumference, the length of circumference to diameter, that ratio is always a fixed constant. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that fascinating? And it's called pi. And
right.
It's actually called pi.
Yeah, it is fascinating in a way that you can use that and reliably stand upon that, which one of the things about history is that you can't always. There are some things about history, some lessons you learn that you can fairly reliably lean on, but there's always the element of humanistic, I guess, wrinkles that may or may not. People say we learn history so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and yes. I always joke and say, of course, we're failing at that, but a part of that is because even though, I think about it, maybe a context that might make sense to some listeners is if you look at the NCAA basketball tournament here in the States or any sort of tournament, you can look and say, well, according to the math or the statistical probability, this team should win, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't always happen, which is why we play the game. But circumference of a circle always wins. It's never not the same, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? So, absolutely fascinating.
So it's a constant that you can use as sort of a heuristic to solve problems and reliably lean on it.
Yes. And there are these constant ratios that actually exist, not just in circles. They actually exist in similar right angle triangles. So let's say if I have a right angle triangle, that's a 30-60 degree right angle triangle, but I have a smaller version of that exact same triangle, there'll be ratios of those two triangles with different sides that will be fixed constants too. It's fascinating.
So the skills that you mentioned, so the ability to, and I don't know if you would put one over the other, sort of the math concepts that they're learning versus the skills that you mentioned, sort of these soft skills, that kind of thing, that I think most of us would agree are really important. And I'm wondering how you think about those. You mentioned, I think, transfer. How do we make sure, what are the things that we should be doing in classrooms to make sure that we're getting kids to be able to transfer those skills?
Right. Okay. So how do we help our students to transfer and apply different skills and their understandings to different situations? I think we need to give students agency, and giving students agency means that you're really allowing them to generalize. So something that I sometimes see in some IB schools, we have statements of inquiry. I'm not sure, Drew, are you familiar with IB schools and some of the programs? Oh, great. So, in the MYP, they have statements of inquiry. In the PYP, they have central ideas, and these are statements of conceptual understanding. And I think it's very important that we do not share these statements of conceptual understanding, and we really give our students the opportunity to communicate these understandings through either guiding questions or other ways. So guiding questions are either factual questions or conceptual questions. Sometimes you want to use debatable questions to provoke thought and curiosity, I think, at the beginning of the unit. But we really want to, if we want students to be able to apply and transfer the understandings, they need to communicate those understandings first and foremost. And then we can design all sorts of lovely performance authentic tasks, using different models. I think the understanding by design, they like to use the GRASS model for designing performance tasks. I use the RAFS model, which is all very similar. And it really gives that summative piece a context and an audience, different roles, and the understandings that you're aiming for in terms of student understanding. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So do you think, and this I have seen debated or asked about, and I certainly have an opinion on it. I'm wondering what your feeling is. Do you think we can teach those kinds of skills? And is skills the right terminology, or does it even matter? We tweeted a piece that we have published called 7 Skills Students Will Always Need. So curiosity and imagination, initiative and entrepreneurship, agility and adaptability, critical thinking and problem solving, effective oral and written communication, collaboration across networks and leading by influence, and then accessing and analyzing information. Are those skills, and can we teach them?
Okay, I'm going to be really interested to hear your response. My opinion is that yes, these are skills. So what I was talking about earlier were understanding. So I do want to distinguish the difference between what students need to know, what they need to understand, and what they need to do. So the KUD model that I think Carol Ann Tomlinson uses, as well as Dr. Lynn Erickson. So skills, yes, can be explicitly taught, and I think that it's important to actually explicitly teach skills and to help students attain those different levels in terms of the skills. Understandings are something that you want students to be able to have from what they know and do. So they need to be able to know certain facts, do particular skills, and then teachers help students to be able to communicate the understandings that are drawn from those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the difference between knowing and understanding, I think, is a really important distinction. I think I've said it before on a podcast. There's so many things we know about. So from in the States here, we're talking about elections, and so people know how elections work generally, but they don't understand how they work in depth, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that, whether we want to call them skills or habits or traits, I think, and I had responded to this Twitter thread because somebody had asked, are these really skills or traits, and can we transfer them? And I think we can. Some of them may be more skills, like it is a skill to be able to do. When I think about skills, my first thinking is, can you do it? And that's the do part, right? So
yes,
exactly. Can I think critically and solve problems? Well, I don't know that you can necessarily teach somebody how to do that in a way of just sort of that focal knowledge of this is exactly the way you would do it. But you would say, here are some ways in which you would go about doing that, and the practice, right? So giving students the opportunity to practice that and learn what worked, what didn't work, and giving them time to process and reflect. Those are the things that help them to learn how to think critically or take initiative or those kinds of things. And then thus you have, in a way, taught it, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes there's so many different terms that mean the same thing. I think some people call it competencies, traits, skills. It's basically something that you can explicitly teach to students. I think we do a lot of these skills implicitly as teachers. But I think, these approaches to learning skills that you talk about really should be explicitly taught. And I know that they are really showcased in the IB programs. They really focus on the approaches to learning skills and teaching these explicitly. So I think I have to agree with you.
Yeah. So then the balance of sort of teaching content and these concepts of math, for example, versus teaching thinking skills, if that's what we want to call them. Where do we start? Do you think we start with using the content to teach thinking skills, or do we teach thinking skills to get to the content?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to go back to, this is something that my dear friend James Tanton, I don't know if you know him, is a wonderful math educator. He says that content is the vehicle for thinking. And I just love that quote because, we do use the content in mathematics, but it's the vehicle to allow us to be able to think critically, to foster creativity, and to problem solve. So I suppose that means that they go hand in hand, really. You can't have one without the other. You can't think without any content.
Right. We have a blog piece that is one of my favorites that we've published. It's something, are you teaching content or teaching thought? And it asked that question, right? So I think most teachers, and traditionally we have started with the content and hope to get some thinking skills out of the kids. But what if we started with sort of a curriculum that was more focused on thinking skills, and as you said, sort of the vessel and the grist for the mill, or the weight that they're lifting is the content, right? Because certainly there's no, and I think this is a real shame that progressive constructivist teaching has been labeled this way, perhaps rightfully so, in that content and knowledge seems to suffer. And I've had multiple conversations with people on the podcast, off the podcast, and I think that is not good teaching, right? That we definitely, knowledge needs to be an integral part of that. But not that focal knowledge, which is just that quick recall of things for the task at hand, but that tacit knowledge of being able to use it, and again, that transferability. So when we shift to a curriculum and an approach that uses thought as the hopeful ideal outcome, with the content being the grist for the mill, the weight that we're using, then it gets to a more rich use of that content or ability to transfer in that tacit knowledge. But there's also, I think, something that we have to recognize is that it does take time. We talked about that earlier. So when when it takes more time, that means that maybe, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, I think it's absolutely vital that we really recognize that not necessarily all of the content and all of the knowledge that is in these textbooks or, curriculum guides or whatever is absolutely necessary for every kid to know. And it's not even realistic. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. Like, I have to completely agree with you, Drew. I think there's a misconception about the social constructivists and even concept-based curriculum that, people think concept-based teaching for conceptual understanding is only about big ideas, and we sacrifice content and we don't teach the facts and skills. And that's a complete myth. The facts and skills are necessary. That's the content. The content is necessary and goes hand in hand with conceptual understandings. And I know that around the world, there's a few different camps. There's the back to basics camp. I've heard in the UK, they believe that you either teach facts and skills or you teach for conceptual understandings. And in fact, that is a false dichotomy, because they actually, go hand in hand. You need facts and skills in order to be able to understand. But I really like what you said in terms of, I suppose, ensuring that thought and the critical thinking and the creativity is not neglected. Like, we can use our content and make it very creative, inquiry-based, project-based, but we need to kind of be explicit about those very important skills that you mentioned, and explicitly helping our students to see what that looks like and how to develop those skills, because I think those skills can be developed and taught.
Yeah, and so again, and I think I want to recognize and really make sure that people understand that I think we're both talking about this is what constructivist progressive education should be. But
exactly.
But there are teachers, just like there are very traditional teachers that are doing that very poorly. There are social constructivist, progressive-ish teachers that are doing that very poorly, and that problem is a real problem, that their students are unfortunately not coming away with what they need either in skills or knowledge, right? So
that's correct.
Yeah. So how do we make sure that, and if we think about it, maybe even in terms of how we work with leadership and curriculum design, how do we make sure as much as possible that problem is getting solved, that the students are learning how to think, but they're also coming away with really important content knowledge?
Yeah, that's a very good question. How do we help leaders and curriculum developers really understand that content, facts, and skills is a necessary part of conceptual understanding and developing critical thinking skills? I think that's why I'm so busy. I was just at a school in Malaysia, and when I talked about, I actually have a graphical representation of this. So I have two hands holding each other. So two hands are shaking each other. One side is the facts and skills. The other side is the conceptual understandings. And I say that they go hand in hand. How do we achieve this synergy between the facts and skills and conceptual understandings? We use the inquiry-based continuum. So the inquiry-based learning continuum helps connect those low levels of thinking with the high levels of thinking. So, in terms of, and when I tell people, where we discuss this model, this graphical representation of the facts and skills and understandings, I sometimes get applause. Actually, this time in Malaysia, one of the teachers gave me a star and said, everything we've heard about progressive education and concept-based is about sacrificing content, and that we don't, we have to take away some content. We don't teach the facts and skills anymore. And you're the first person to come along and say, actually, they go hand in hand, because facts and skills provide a foundation. And I think concept-based curriculum has been around for about 3 decades. It was pioneered by my mentor, Dr. Lynn Erickson. And, people, as you say, sometimes misinterpret the framework or the model and lose the integrity. And, Dr. Lynn Erickson has never said we sacrifice content. at all. So it's very important that we use the content as this vehicle, and we use the content as this foundation in this three-dimensional model for curriculum instruction to really build understanding. We cannot build understanding without a foundation or without a content. But content, as we know, knowledge, as we know, is a commodity, right? It's not that important to memorize an algorithm or a fact necessarily in the 21st century. Our students can Google any kind of piece of knowledge that they want. What really is important is what they do with that knowledge. How do they apply and transfer and understand that knowledge in different contexts and different situations?
Yeah, the way that in a previous podcast a few episodes ago, I think Dr. Tim Simpson put it, and he was talking about classical education. And if you listen to that one, but I love the way that he phrased it, and I would have. I agree with this wholeheartedly, is that as an outcome, I think it's maybe better to have students know what questions are really important in that discipline, in that core content or whatever, versus knowing the answers. And
I love that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, you have to know the answers, or lots of the answers and content, to know what questions. And so it's getting past that lower level. And you mentioned continuum and kind of a spectrum kind of thing. When you work with teachers, and this is something that I've thought more about recently, I find fascinating, because in our work with teachers, and I'm assuming in your work with teachers it's not any different, is that you experience a range of abilities in teachers to, let's just say, teach, right? So there's lots that goes in that, right? So their content knowledge, their sort of facilitation skills, their classroom management, their experience, their confidence. But is there some value to using a different approach with some teachers? Or, I mean, I'm not even sure the question I'm asking, and it can be a really tricky one. I mean, it almost feels like when we work with some teachers on some, because we've already noted that inquiry-based, and we talk about project-based learning a lot, which is sort of that next step, is that there are some teachers that are really going to struggle with that from the onset, and maybe not ever really get there to a high level of efficacy. So what do we do with those kinds of teachers?
What a great question. I think, teaching is this complex, dynamic, exciting craft, right? And it's not easy, but I think that's part of why we love it, because every interaction that we have with students and every lesson is different. I think in the 27 years I taught, I never taught a single lesson the same, because my cohorts, were always very different. Now, in terms of teachers, and their different backgrounds and their confidence and the different strengths that they have is probably the same excitement I get when I teach students, teenagers. And I think there has to be some scaffolding and prompting. So in inquiry-based work, I listened to your podcast with Kath Murdoch, which is fantastic. And, I've read extensively on different inquiry models as well. And I'm a firm believer that there are 3 or 4, that most writers say 3. There are some educators that say 4 levels of inquiry, depending on the teacher confidence, depending on the student readiness, depending on student background, and depending on, what the strengths of the teacher are. So an inquiry-based model is not just open discovery, where you go and ask kids to find out, go and research all of these things by yourself. I think that's another myth about inquiry-based learning. We have a very structured approach, which has lots of prompts, really scaffolds student thinking, and really helps teachers, I think, to kind of start letting go. I think it's about letting go, right? That the teacher is not seen as the answer machine, but really there to kind of support student thinking. So you've got the very structured approach. The next level would be the guided approach, which has less prompts. And then you might move to an open, inquiry approach, which has less prompts, there's more freedom, and teachers are very comfortable with using it. And I remember one of the schools I worked with in Asia, we were looking at a very structured approach to start with, because I knew that the school would be at the beginning of their journey. And they said to me, And the structured approach looked like a lot of questions, a lot of prompts. There was no answers, but lots of diagrams and questions that, students had to kind of go through in terms of their mathematical thinking. And a couple of teachers said to me, "This is an inquiry." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you're kind of like just giving them different questions to lead them to some kind of understanding." And I went, "But yes, maybe that's what they need. Inquiry is not just go and find out a topic and go and research on the internet for an hour by yourself, The other thing is the bad use of inquiry. I've had to tell a lot of teachers that, looking up vocabulary words, let's say I have to look up the vocabulary word for discriminant, which is a maths vocabulary word. Asking students to spend half an hour looking up a vocabulary word is not good use of inquiry. And so we have to really think about what does good inquiry looks like. Yes, it will have prompts. And yes, there may be some direct instruction of low-level facts and skills, that are necessary when students kind of need that. But it's not all hands off open discovery. And so I think that really does then give a lot of teachers confidence to try the inquiry. And I think I'm a firm believer of, give a woman a fish, you feed her for a day, teach her how to fish and you'll feed her for a lifetime. So I kind of give a few different learning experiences that are either structured, guided or open. That model the inductive teaching approach. They're inquiry-based that kind of elicit conceptual understanding. And then we use that framework and the tenets and all the jigsaw pieces that we spend 2 or 3 days unpacking and designing and helping teachers then to design their own learning engagements, because that's my ultimate goal, that I help teachers to see what good learning looks like in the mathematics classroom using inquiry, focusing on conceptual understanding with an inductive approach.
So there's two things in two different directions. I've got a fork in the road here, so I'm going to try to go down one and then come back on another. One of the things that you sort of mentioned that I think, and I definitely agree with it. We talk about sort of starting point, and we want to do this with students, which is one of those forks. But where are you, and how can we move you forward in a meaningful way, and building that capacity within a school and within teachers to, like you say, learn how to fish, not here's your fish kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But one of the sort of obstacles and the noise of the way that professional development is done, and I'm sure you've experienced this as we have in schools, and teachers often, when we go into schools sometimes, and I don't know how much of it is underlying and how much of it is out there in the open, but sometimes we even have teachers who are like, oh boy, here we go, another professional development thing that's happening, right? And so what are some of those sort of durable anchors of professional development that help teachers and schools make the progress over time, as opposed to sort of getting started on learning how to fish and then stopping fishing, I guess, if that makes that's a terrible analogy, but
no, I get it. No, I completely get it, Drew. So I think it's important that when we're facilitating professional learning and development opportunities, that we model what we're preaching, that we talk the talk and we walk the walk. So, when you go to those conferences and they talk to you for an hour and they say, don't teach like how I'm teaching now, but here are some good ways to teach. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so you have to walk the walk. So from the get-go, from the minute that I start with a group of teachers or a community of teachers, I am modeling pedagogical practices and strategies all the way through. That's how they're learning the content. So that's how they're learning about the concept-based mathematics model, through different pedagogical strategies that will emphasize the understanding, through structured inquiry. It could be guided inquiry. And, it's so important to, I think, build that trust and earn respect in that way, that I'm a classroom practitioner and this is how we're going to professionally learn together, like this is a classroom. And I think that works wonders. I think if I stood there lecturing, for the entire day, I don't think I would earn the respect and build trust. And I think that's important, that when you're facilitating and helping professionals learn and grow, that you do build that very important that very important relationship, that rapport of trust, and to act more as a coach. When I go to workshops, I don't know everything. I'm not there to preach it, to teachers. In fact, I'm there to kind of really help teachers collaboratively co-construct their understandings and use their experience. I think we really have to value teachers' experience and what they bring as well. And so my model is completely constructivist, that here are some ideas. How can we incorporate them into the wonderful work that you're already doing? And let's move in a direction where we can be very intentional in terms of unit planning and then have this wonderful impact with student learning in the classroom.
So what are the things that get in the way of the teachers that you work with, for example, in doing great work as a teacher in applying this kind of work?
What are things that get in the way? I have to be very patient and take it slowly. So I may spend half a day on just this question: why do we need to teach for conceptual understanding? And there's all sorts of different activities that we do, because that mindset, as you know, Drew, because you probably provide a lot of professional development for a lot of teachers, it's changing the mindset first. Once you change that mindset and a teacher is more open and receptive, then you start to change a bit of practice, right? And then that may have ramifications with student learning, but you need to kind of really address the mindset first. So I think the difficulties I've had are really, I think, if I've rushed it a little bit, because how all teachers worry about getting through the content.
Sure.
And so I've learned to let that go. That, when I set an agenda out, I put a caveat: I may not get through this depending on the group, because I'm constantly formatively assessing as we go through these days of professional development to see, well, if this group is not ready for the next stage, I'm not going to go on. I'm going to spend longer, and sometimes that has repercussions,
right?
Because schools can say, you haven't got through your agenda,
Yeah.
You plan these things and you haven't got through. But I put that caveat that it really depends on the group, and I'm going to formatively assess what I think needs to be, emphasized and what needs to be elaborated on further.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I just yesterday sent an agenda upon request to a school that I'm going to be doing some work with, and they said, again, a fairly typical, you have an agenda that we can share. And often I hesitate to even do that, even though that's sort of a best practice, or at least it's accepted. People I think it's sort of a comfort blanket of like, oh, here's the stuff that we're going to be doing. And it feels like there's at least a plan here, which I totally get that. But I did that same asterisk, like, this is a working agenda and subject to change based on the progress of the group and the needs. And so how do we, sometimes we move more quickly, and I like to frame it.
Exactly.
Like, sometimes there are groups that move much more quickly. Very rarely do we not get to the space, but that is another problem that is, I think, it brings me back to the beginning of the fork in the road here, because it's the same thing with our professional development. We're limited in the amount of, let's say, contact hours that we have with a group, right? So when we go to work with a school, we're there for 1 or 2 or 3 days or whatever, right? We can't say, well, I'll just stay on a 4th day here because we didn't make as much progress, right? And there's an inherent problem in that. And so when we do formative assessment in our workshops, what do we do? How do we follow up? How do we, if there are 35 people in the room and 2 of them are really struggling, we have to differentiate and think about how we're going to move forward and best use that time.
Definitely.
Right.
Definitely.
So backing up to that fork in the road, the question that the other question I wanted to ask, which is related to one of, I think, two of your blog pieces about grouping and student grouping, right? And what you call ability
very controversial
grouping. Right,
yes,
it is
very controversial.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about that. Give us a little insight into how you think about that, if you would.
Yeah, this is kind of opening up a can of worms, which I'm really happy to do. I think the world is pretty polarized when it comes to ability grouping in mathematics specifically. I don't think it happens as often as in other disciplines. I don't think in history they ability group, or in English do they ability group. But for some reason, this practice has come out of mathematics, and that's kind of created this social inequity and really this labeling of students, which in my opinion is so wrong. I think it's important that we try to promote social equity by having students of different backgrounds, different strengths in mathematics to be able to share and collaborate and discuss their mathematical thinking. And it's something that I was very honored to be part of the curriculum review group for the new IB Diploma maths courses. So it's the grade 11 and 12 mathematics courses. And it's something, one of the models that we're trying to encourage is there's a standard level course and a high level course. And one model is that we're encouraging teachers to perhaps group the standard and high level students together, and teach them together in a mixed ability setting. And I've actually talked to quite a few schools that are kind of really embracing this idea. It's almost absurd where that this has actually even come about in terms of the tracking. I think you call it tracking in the US. You would never separate children on anything else such as hair color or eye color or any other kind of attribute, or any kind of characteristic they may have. And other discipline areas, do not use this kind of tracking system either. So I think what's happened as a result of tracking, and we call it streaming in the UK, is that you have this anxiety and you have these labels of giftedness. That this worries me too, that there are some students that are gifted and then there are some students that are apparently not gifted. When I was in the classroom, all my students were gifted in some way. You find strengths and you find sparks and you find those light bulb moments with every child, because you value every child's disposition and their learning, and you value their contribution in the classroom. So, yeah, my two blog articles are very much research-based, because I think a lot of teachers want to see the evidence that, tracking actually has very little effect on student achievement, and in fact is more detrimental to the majority of students. But I just think, on a personal level, the injustice and the inequity of having that label is just creating more problems in terms of maths anxiety and fear around the world.
Well, it's an interesting, I think it's a different conversation than I like to have around grouping, because we talk about groups and teams quite a bit in project-based learning because it's fairly typical. And one of the things that I get frustrated about is that it's what I think is a false dichotomy, and I'm not in favor of tracking or doing that. The bluebirds and the redbirds of the that they stay in that, right? But to recognize that there are students that are in different places, and that's the reality. Just like there's with adults and professional learners and all of that. So giving an opportunity and providing structures in which they can learn and differentiating that instruction. But what I find to be really frustrating is that it's either you group them or you don't. And why does that feel like when we put kids in groups, why would they have to stay in those groups?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So it would make sense to me. I'm not a math teacher, But when I think about teaching anything, it would make sense to me. And I would, for example, one of the formative assessment pieces, ways that I would formatively assess learning would be to ask students to respond to a question, short answer, which is, social studies type of format. And then I would also ask them to respond with, are you confused? Do you think you're confused about this? Or maybe you got it, or no, you're for sure. My feedback to them was, you're confused about this, or maybe, but you haven't explained it well, or boy, you've got it. And then I can use that to sort of, let's say, ability group and say all the confused and maybes over here, and then you can sort of teach to that group and or pair them up with the for sures or whatever. But that's a learning specific piece, and in a really complex and nuanced learning environment, there are all kinds of different ways. So you might then regroup, and we do this in our professional learning, right? So we group and we regroup, and then thinking about and kind of getting back to one of the things you mentioned originally was that purpose and why. So why are we doing what we're doing, and how can we best structure the environment, and some of that is groups, to get the most out of the learning that we're doing, but don't feel like they have to stay in those groups. And I feel it's such a frustration. It's like once we put the slow learners with the slow learners, they have to stay with the slow learners. Like, no.
For the entire year. In a classroom in the entire year.
Yeah.
So, I love the flexibility and the fluidity that you talk about within grouping, because of course we, use the strategy of different groupings within our classrooms, with one class. The tracking is completely different, where you isolate, students of different abilities, and they stay in that class, and there's normally very detrimental effects. But within the class, you're constantly being very flexible. And, in my workshops, I run workshops for pre-K to 12. So this means that in any one workshop, let's say there are 60 teachers, there'll be pre-K teachers. There'll be teachers that teach 3-year-olds mathematics. There'll be teachers that teach 10-year-olds mathematics. And there'll be teachers that teach students that are 18. I meant students. Did I say teachers?
Right.
I meant students. So there'll be teachers that teach students that are 18 years old. Now, how on earth can you run a professional development course that caters from pre-K to 12 mathematics? If that can be done, that means that within one grade level, you can actually have a mixed ability setting. And then within your class, you can regroup and group and be flexible and, not have labels on particular students, and students have equal opportunities to the best teachers. And, so I think, something really for us to think about. I'm really talking about the traditional tracking sense of being in that fixed classroom, often with a less experienced teacher who, and having that label.
Yeah, and as I think more about these labels, and I think one of the things that would help, so there's a reality, again, that there are people at different places. There always has been, there always will be, and that's natural. And as a matter of fact, that's okay, right? So
perfectly.
The part of the culture of our education system has created this sort of stigma to not being as smart or whatever. Like, so I have daughters 10 and 12, and I talk about them on the podcast. My oldest daughter, for example, she's actually quite good at math, I think. I would say she's probably has more of an affinity for it and aptitude for it than I did as a kid, and probably do today. But there's also I think there's a group, or it's like she in her testing and her scores or whatever metrics that they use to differentiate some of these kids. There are some kids who are in some ways better than her, and she came home and she's like, I'm not in that group, and and she was frustrated by that because she's a people pleaser and she wants to be good and all those things. And I said, sweetheart, first of all, learning is not linear about math or anything. Like your developmental process is different. There's also some other things that you're really great at that maybe they struggle with, and that it's part of this culture that we need to shift that would help. So then the sort of tracking doesn't become such an issue, because as you mentioned, sort of the shame or stigma of being labeled that way, as opposed to when we talk about meaningful assessment, right? So we want that assessment and that feedback to be like, oh, so I'm struggling with this, and that's okay, and I've identified it, and it's helpful to move forward, as opposed to I'm so dumb.
Exactly. I mean, on the other end of the spectrum, Drew, there's also an issue with giftedness and gifted programs.
Right.
So if you're in that top, whatever it's called, track, and the acceleration that occurs sometimes sacrifices understanding, because they're accelerating at a rate which sacrifices the conceptual understanding. I think it's a lot more important to help students understand in terms of the depth of content and the concepts involved, rather than just a breadth and accelerating through quickly. Some of the most successful systems in the world, such as Shanghai Maths and even Singapore Maths, they really focus on depth of understanding, and they don't accelerate, and they have mixed ability groupings in mathematics. So that's why that's one of the contributors of success in terms of Shanghai Maths and Singapore Maths.
Right. Well, I'm mindful of your time, and I want to give you an opportunity to share links and things like that, but also you have a book that was published, I think, 2016, Concept-Based Mathematics, and we'll link to that in the show notes. But
thank you.
Yeah, but what are the places and links and things that folks where should they find you?
Well, please connect with me at Twitter. So my handle is @Jennifer Wathall. It's a great source of professional learning for me and a great network. My website is jenniferchangwathall.com. That's my landing page, and that will take you to my blog and any other courses that I run. And I've just released 4 books, actually, from Oxford University Press. They're student reference books for the new Diploma maths courses. So I'm really excited about that too.
Okay, great. One last question before we depart here is, what do we get wrong about sort of math curriculum? I know one of the things that I find to be a real struggle is the upper level math, and how that sometimes is a gate that keeps some kids from advancing on, matriculating, or getting really frustrated with math. But if you were going to redesign math curriculum for your ideal school, what would that focus on, or what might sort of fall by the wayside as being less important?
I think the myth of practice makes perfect, because practice does not make perfect. Have you ever been on the road driving and you've seen those drivers that have been driving for 20 years and they're still really bad drivers, but yet they practice every single day? So for me, I would get rid of the drill and kill aspect in the worksheets of mathematics, and I would focus on very purposeful questions that focus on the concept, the atypical concept, and the non-concept. So those kind of 3 big areas. And I think if students see what the concept is, what it's not, the non-concept, and then a atypical concept, I think that really helps with their deep understanding of mathematics.
Okay, and is upper level math something that you really think is important for all, or is there? I guess let me ask it this way: for the general public who is not going to go into a very math specific career, let's say, what's the upper level of conceptual math and sort of subject area that you think really need to get to, and how would that look?
I think I'd love to see a lot more statistics and probability, only because I think, for a lot of different professions it's going to be relevant, and it's becoming more relevant. Big data is becoming more relevant, and statistics, I think, is really gaining popularity in a lot of different programs at high school and having more prominence. So definitely more statistics. I mean, of course, I love my calculus, and I think everyone should be doing it. However, it's not something that everyone's going to take forward, but definitely statistics and probability.
Yeah, I would argue on the calculus piece, having like, wow, that's and you know, it's funny because we do find that to be that sort of physics and calculus in high school to be a gate here in the States, where that some kids are failing those courses and then not really, or doing poorly in them, and then not getting into schools that they want to get into, or things like that. And of course, that question, the age-old question of anything, but probably maybe more so prevalent in math, is when are we going to ever use this? Why is this important?
Yeah.
Which is it's a really hard question to answer with lots of things, especially the way that we think about education. But the idea of calculus, I mean, there are not very many people, and correct me if I'm wrong, that are as a whole of our population who are actually using calculus on a regular basis.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, if it was approached in a way where students could appreciate what calculus was, I would say at high school I probably could do everything in calculus, but it was only reaching university that I really understood what it was about. So perhaps if the focus was different in terms of a calculus program, and students really appreciated, you know, the beauty and understood the concepts that were involved, then it's kind of developing those critical thinking, problem-solving skills, isn't it, that we want students to have. So regardless of whatever the content is, we can use that content to really foster those higher order level thinking skills.
Yeah, and I think that's the argument that I've heard from other math practitioners, and I agree with it. The sort of the thinking process that you gain by engaging in that, not necessarily that you can do calculus or physics as you go forward as a 25, 30, 50-year-old, but that you can think like a high-level mathematician, and that's important, is as important as anything. So, Jennifer, I really appreciate the time. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it too. Thank you, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.